Good afternoon class and welcome sa ating Obligations and Contracts class. Last time, na-discuss natin yung law in general. But for this lesson, we will be starting with our discussion on obligations. Now, for your reference, maglalagay tayo sa website ng copy ng civil code so that you will see yung exact na provisions ng law on obligations and contracts. So, for today, we will be discussing the concept of obligation in general. What is obligations? And ano-ano yung mga sources ng obligations? And what are the kinds of obligations? Now, the diagram that you are seeing now, it will be uploaded din sa website. So, I believe you can look it up before you watch, or siguro afterwards tignan nyo na rin. But basically it's here now, so i-discuss natin yan one by one. So the definition of obligations is written in article 1156 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. It's called New Civil Code, but it's basically old. Luma na siya. So, according to Article 1156 of the New Civil Code, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Now, unahan ko na kayo. This is a rich source of exam questions, so might as well memorize that. Pero more than memorizing yung definition given under Article 1156, mas maigi siguro if we dig deeper into what obligations mean. Now, an obligation has four requisites, as you can see in the far right or left, depende kung nasaan kayo. So, the four requisites of obligations are passive subject, active subject, object or prestation, and juridical tie. Now, these are jargons, but I'll try my best to discuss it the simplest way I can. The passive subject is the person bound to the fulfillment of an obligation. Now, in an obligation, there are always two parties, the passive subject and the active subject. Dalawang tao or entities yan. Now, si passive subject is the person bound to the fulfillment of the obligation. Or in short, if we put that in question form, who is required to fulfill the obligation? We will give examples later so that you will understand kung ano itong mga tinutukoy natin. But basically, passive subject is sino ba ang dapat mag-fulfill ng obligation niya in this case. Now, the active subject naman, on the contrary, is the person entitled to demand the fulfillment of the obligation. Now, kung yung kanina si passive subject, he or she is bound to fulfill yung obligation. Yung active subject naman natin, siya ang entitled na mag-demand ng obligation. O in short, who has the right to demand the fulfillment of the obligation? Sino ang recipient, kumbaga, nung i-fulfill ni passive subject? Object or prestation naman in the requisites is the subject matter of the obligation. Ngayon, don't be confused, since this is an object, this is not necessarily we are not talking here about a noun or a thing. We are talking here of action, actually. So, in the object or obligation part of the requisites, we ask the question, what is the action required of the passive subject? Ano ang dapat gawin ni passive subject? That is basically the question when we say object or prestation. And finally, juridical tie. When you say juridical tie, ano yung tie na nagbibigkis sa dalawang parties? What is the legal relationship between the two parties? Ano ang tie na nagko-connect sa kanila? Now, itong juridical tie, to answer this juridical tie, we refer to the sources of obligations, but we will deal with that later. Now, let's start with an example para maintindihan natin yung apat na elements ng obligation. Now, for example, I promise to give J my laptop. So again, the obligation is I promise to give J my laptop. Kailan, paano, saan, walang additional instructions. So in that case, my obligation there is to give the laptop to J, di ba? So who is the passive subject in that obligation? So the passive subject, again, balikan natin, is the person bound to the fulfillment of the obligation. Sino ba ang obligado na i-fulfill yung obligation? In that case, it's me. So I am the passive subject in that obligation. Who is the active subject? Sabi nga kanina, ang active subject dyan ay kung sino ang entitled doon sa fulfillment ng obligation. Sino ba ang nararapat na makatanggap nung ibibigay kong laptop? It's J, correct? So that is the active subject. Now, bakit active subject si J? Because, again, siya yung pwedeng mag-demand ng obligation. Active siya in a sense na siya kasi yung gagalaw para to compel me to give yung promise ko sa kanya na laptop. That's what an active subject is. So, object or prestation, ano yung subject matter ng obligation? Now, again, we're referring to action, not the thing. Ano? So, in this case, the object or prestation of the obligation is to give the laptop. To give. Hindi yung laptop but to give the laptop. Yung action of giving the laptop, yun ang obligation. Ayun yung object or prestation rather. And finally, juridical tie. Now, what is the basis or ano yung legal relationship namin when it comes to yung promise ko to give the laptop? So, before we go to the example below, let's go first to the different sources of obligation. Now, there are 5 sources of obligations. We have law, contracts, quasi-contracts, delict, and quasi-delicts. Now, for law, what we mean here is all obligations arising from law are not supposed to be presumed. They must be in writing and they must be acts of Congress, gaya ng pag-aralan natin last time. So, the law creates certain obligations that are written, and these are not presumed. For example, the obligation to give support is written in the law. Like, yung parents are required to give financial and other support to their children for education, sustenance, transportation, and all of these things. Also, marriage. In marriage, the couple is obliged actually to live under the same roof and be together. Of course, may exception doon, but at the end of the day, these are obligations arising from law. Now, what we mean when we say it must not be presumed is that it must be written. Kailangan nakasulat doon sa batas kung ano yung mga obligasyon na to. If something is not written, it is not your obligation. If it's not written in the law, it's not your obligation under the law. But again, there can be other sources of obligations. Okay, so that is the first kind. The second source of obligation that we will be discussing are contracts. Now again, uh, our subject matter is obligations and contracts. So we will, if you can see, the subject matters that will be covered by this subject is from from the more general term obligation to the more specific contracts. Ano? So in contracts, or rather, these contracts are the law between the parties, and they must be complied with in good faith. Now, uh, what do we mean when we say contracts are the law between the parties? Now, sa mga kontrata kasi, meron tayong mga bagay na pinag-agrihan o mga there are certain stipulations doon sa contract, like kung saan magbabayad, kung sino ang magbabayad, kung paano ang bayaran, kung ano ang i-deliver, all of these things, these are what we call stipulations in a contract. And these contracts are binding between the two parties who made them. So yung kontrata, be it oral or written, binding yon sa dalawa o higit pang partidos doon sa kontrata. So, in a sense, parang yung itong contracts na ito ay ang batas sa pagitan ng dalawang tao. Now, what do we mean when we say this is the law that governs the relationship of the two or more parties in a contract? It means na all stipulations must be complied with in good faith. So dapat lahat ng laman ng kontrata must be ay dapat masunod, ay kailangan sundin ng bawat party doon sa kontrata. Now, as we will learn later on, these contracts, itong mga kontratang ito must not be contrary to law. Hindi dapat sila lumalabag sa batas, otherwise that they are illegal. So they must not be against the law. Another source of obligations are what we call quasi-contracts. Now, they are quasi-contracts or like contracts. Yun actually yung literal na translation ng quasi-contracts, like contracts. They are like contracts in a sense that they involve two people. But they are not contracts because it is unilateral. Ibig sabihin, it is made without an actual agreement between two people. Hindi sila nag-agree to do something. It is just the voluntary action of another. So in this but even so, it is a source of obligation because it is written in the civil code. Now, what are the kinds of quasi-contracts? Now we have two kinds of quasi-contracts. We have nexorum gesture and solution indebiti. However you pronounce these two things, pero basically these two quasi-contracts are based on lawful, unilateral, and voluntary acts. Ngayon, pag sinabi natin lawful, kailangan hindi siya labag sa batas, 'di ba? Pangalawa, kailangan unilateral lang siya. It is the action of one party for the benefit of another. Pero not necessarily nag-agree sila, hindi. They did not agree, kaya nga siya hindi contract. And it must be voluntary. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya inutusan ng second party to do something. So, what are these two kinds of quasi-contracts? First, we have negotiorum hestio. Now, the definition of negotiorum hestio is voluntary administration of someone else's property or affairs. Without his consent o nang hindi siya pumapayag. which gives rise to an obligation to reimburse. Now, let's discuss that one by one. Now, voluntary administration of property or affairs. Kumbaga, someone took care of the property or yung mga affairs ng isang tao while he is away or while he is not there. For example, may garden yung kapitbahay nyo, but then again, iniwan nila yon for a 1 month vacation. Ngayon, wala namang sinabi sa'yo na wala namang sinabi sa inyo na diligan niyo yung halaman nila or what. Walang binili. So, but you notice na namamatay na yung mga halaman nila. So, what did you do? Tinanggalan mo ng damo, diniligan mo, nilagyan mo ng fertilizer. And then, lumago siya. Now, in that case, someone else is benefited. Tama? Yung mga kapitbahay mo. But did you ask something, but did they ask you to do that? Hindi, di ba? So, it is a case of negosyorum gesture. Kasi hindi naman, wala silang consent na gawin mo yon. But anyway, it benefited them. Na benefit sila doon. So, what is their obligation? Their obligation is actually to reimburse you for what you spent. What are the expenses that you made doon sa kanilang taniman. Now, again, let's go back to the definition of negosyorum gestio. Voluntary administration of property. You took care of yung properties nila while they're away without their consent. Wala nga sila, so how can they consent to it, di ba? And anyway, it is voluntary. And it gives rise to the obligation to reimburse. So, they have to reimburse you for your expenses doon sa pag take care mo doon sa mga halaman nila. Another example. For example, yung nasusunog yung bahay ng kapitbahay mo. Wala sila diyan. But anyway, you inapula mo yung apoy, etc. Gumamit ka ng tubig and other necessary expenses. Ngayon, is it lawful? Yes, because kung nasusunog na nga, what's the problem with that if you help someone, di ba? That's lawful. It is unilateral because hindi naman nila sinabing apulain mo yung apoy, but you did anyway. And it is voluntary. It is voluntary kasi ginawa mo yun out of nothing. Hindi siya part ng isang contract, etc. So that is an example of negosyorum gestio. Now, in that case, ano yung obligation ng may-ari ng bahay? Yung obligation ng may-ari ng bahay is to actually reimburse you for what you paid doon sa pag-apula ng apoy. Now, let's change the facts. Balik tayo dun sa unang case, yung halaman sa halaman ng kapitbahay mo. What if nung umalis sila, they actually said, "Uy, pakitignan naman yung halaman namin. I will pay you habang wala kami." Is that a quasi-contract? Well, technically hindi na because it is already contractual. Meron na kayong contractual relationship. Meron ng consent on both parties. Sabi nga natin kanina, isa negosyorum gestio without the consent of the owner. So, ang source ng obligation kapag sa ganon, it is already a contract. So, ang source na ng obligation doon, contract na. Not necessarily quasi-contract. Kahit na oral lang yon, contracts can be oral or written. So, that is quasi-contract. That's negosyorum gestio. Now, solution indebiti naman is for mistaken payments or erroneous payments. Now, according dito sa solution indebiti, any payment made, a person who received payment by mistake is obligated to return it. Kumbaga, kung meron kang natanggap na bayad na sobra or not due sa'yo, your obligation is to return it. Now, what do we mean by this? For example, mm, may bumili sa'yo ng sardinas. That's 50 pesos. For example lang. That's 50 pesos. Ang binigay sa'yo ay 1,000. Now, ah, akala nung may-ari 100 lang. So, nung sinukulan mo siya ng 950, binalik sa'yo yung 900. Now, is that a mistaken payment? Yes, may binayad sa'yo na sobra. So what is your obligation? According dito sa rule on quasi-contracts on solution debity, you need to return the 900 na mistakenly paid sa'yo. Or for example, may nagabot sa'yo ng pera. Bayaran ko utang ko, sabi. Pero when you realize later on na when you realize later on, wala pala siyang utang sa'yo, or worse, hindi pala ikaw yung pinagkautangan niya. So do you have the obligation to return the money? Yes, because that is a mistaken payment. Your obligation there is to return the money to whomever it is due. Now, kung titignan natin itong rule on quasi-contract, simple lang ang rason dito. Why this is a source of obligation. So negosyorum gestio, if they administered your property or your affairs, you need to pay them. Sa solution debity, if you receive a mistaken payment, you need to return it. The principle here sa quasi-contracts is that no one must be unjustly enriched. No one must unjustly enrich himself or herself at the expense of others. Hindi dapat the lesson there is hindi dapat tayo nakikinabang unjustly sa mga bagay na that is not due to us, na hindi naman para sa atin. So, yun yung concept ng quasi-contracts. Another source of obligation is delict or crime. Basically crime, anything that is punishable under the revised penal code or special penal laws natin. So sabi diyan, every person who is criminally liable is also civilly liable. So 'di ba, kapag nakukulong yung isang tao, madalas hindi lang siya about yung pagkakulong per se, but there are also civil liabilities that come with it. So, another source of obligation yon. For example, ang sabi sa decision ng court ay you need to pay the victim, indemnify the victim doon sa amount na ninakaw. For example, nagnakaw ng 100,000 worth ng pera. So, if the court says na, ibalik mo yung pera, or rather, kung sinabing ibalik yung pera, you need to return it because that's your obligation based on your criminal liability for robbery or theft. Bukod pa yon doon sa penalty of imprisonment. So that's delict. And finally, we have quasi-delicts. Your obligation to reimburse someone for the commission of a quasi-delict. Now, it is quasi-delict or is otherwise known as criminal negligence. Ito yung mga examples nito ay reckless imprudence resulting in homicide, reckless imprudence resulting in damage to property, mga ganon. Reckless imprudence resulting to slight physical injuries, mga ganon. These are what we call quasi-delicts. And under the law, you are required to reimburse, or you are required to pay someone whom you committed a quasi-delict to. For example, may nasiraan ng property, you need to reimburse the amount of the property that was destroyed. Kung namatay yung isang tao, you need to pay indemnity sa pamilya niya for loss of earning capacity, di ba? Kasi paano naman mabubuhay yung mga anak niya if you are not required to pay, yeah, a certain amount para pang support sa pamilya niya. So yun yung basis natin ng obligations. So again, there are 5 sources of these obligations. We have law, contracts, quasi-contracts, delict, and quasi-delicts. Okay. The next part is on the kinds of obligations. There are 2 kinds of obligations, pero before we discuss that, let's go back to the definition of obligations under 1156, Article 1156 ng New Civil Code. Now, under Article 1156, dun sa kaliwa nyo, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Now, there are, kung tatignan nyo dyan, yung to give, to do, or not to do, di ba tatlo yan? Actually, that is reflected in the kinds of obligations that there are. There are generally 2 kinds of obligations. We have real obligation. In a real obligation, yun yung to give doon sa 1156. A real obligation, in a real obligation, the subject matter is a thing which the obligor must deliver to the obligee. Ano yung obligee and obligor? Parang ano lang din yan. Debtor creditor. Si obligor, pwede na natin siyang tawagin doon sa kabila kanina na passive subject. Doon si obligee ang active subject. So, in a real obligation, ang subject matter or ang object or prestation ng obligation ay to give something, to deliver something. For example, yung dyan sa example natin dyan, X binds himself to deliver a dog to Y. So, dyan, parang ano ang object or prestation dyan? To give or to deliver a dog, di ba? To deliver a dog. So that is giving. That makes it a real obligation. Now, as opposed to a real obligation, sa personal obligation naman, the subject matter is an act to be done or not to be done. Sa personal obligation, dyan naman yung papasok yung to do or not to do doon sa definition ng obligation kanina. Personal obligations can be further subdivided into 2 kinds, the positive and negative personal obligation. Actually, sorry about this, about the handout that I'm flashing now, pero I will be changing it doon na lang sa website. But positive personal obligation is actually the obligation to give, to do. Kasi nga sa real obligation yung to give, So here in positive personal obligation, the subject matter or the object or the object or prestation of the obligation is to give, it is to do something, Na example dyan ay C binds himself to repair the cell phone of D. So that is a positive personal obligation in the sense that the obligation is to do something, or in this case to repair the cell phone of D. That is a positive personal obligation. While in a negative personal obligation or an obligation not to do something, basically you are prohibiting someone to do something. Example dyan, A binds himself not to create a window in his wall so as not to disturb the privacy of his neighbors. Dyan, the object or prestation of the obligation is not to create a window in his wall. Para daw di maistorbo yung privacy ng mga kapitbahay. So you can see here that it is a positive personal obligation kung the object or prestation of the obligation is to do, while negative personal obligation siya kapag it is not to do. So, mahalagang alam natin yung distinction between positive personal obligation and negative personal obligation, because later on this will have very different rules altogether. So, those are the kinds of obligations. We have real obligation for obligation to, or the obligation to give, personal obligation, or the right to, or the obligation to do or not to do. Again, sorry dito about this, about the mistake there in the handout, but yeah. So let's try to figure out the example dito sa baba in order to summarize our learnings dito sa lesson na to, So you are in a catering business. So caterer ka. You entered into a contract with X, yung customer, to cater to her son's 7th birthday celebration. Now, actually, if you will dissect this, there are two obligations here. Yung before the party, the obligation is on you as the caterer. The caterer has the obligation to provide the services, paggawa siguro ng invitation, pag-arrange ng venue, pag-invite ng guest, etc. So in this case, you are the one bound to fulfill the obligation. So you are the passive subject. Ikaw yung dapat mag-fulfill ng obligasyon mo on these matters, So before ng birthday, ikaw ang diyan, ikaw ang in charge. So you will have to fulfill your obligation to X. X is the active subject kasi siya yung entitled na mag-demand na i-fulfill mo yung obligasyon mo. Meaning siya yung he or she is entitled na sabihin sa'yo na, gawin mo na to, gawin mo to, etc. Based doon sa napag-usapan nyo in the contract. Now, yung object or prestation or yung subject matter dito is to cater the birthday of yung anak ni X. So that is what? That is an obligation to do, tama? So since it is an obligation to do, it is what we call a personal obligation. Now, is it positive or negative? Since ang gagawin mo is you actually have to do something, it is a positive personal obligation. Now, what ties you? What is the legal tie between you and X? So the legal tie there is the contract that you entered into. Now, the second aspect of that contract is that after the birthday, tapos na lahat. Ibig sabihin nun, you were already done fulfilling your obligation. So what's next? Who has the obligation now? The obligation now, well, ideally, is X to pay naman. So that is the presumption is the payment is after everything is done, pero in some cases, money first or partial, mga ganyan. But in the presumption in this case is that the presumption in this case is that after the party, saka ka lang babayaran. So in this case, X is the passive subject in a sense na siya na yung dapat mag-fulfill ng kanyang obligation to pay. Tama? So obligation to pay yun. So in this case naman, you are the active subject in a sense that you are the one who can say, hey, bayaran mo na ako. You are the one entitled to the fulfillment of the obligation. Ikaw na yung pwedeng maningil sa kanya. Now, the object or the payment of the catering fee is the object or prestation. Now, what is that? Is that a real obligation or personal obligation? Well, it is a real obligation because he has to give you something. That is money, right? So that is real obligation. And again, the tie here is the juridical tie. The juridical tie rather is the contract between you and X. So, sabi dyan, take note, whoever has the right to demand is the active subject. Kung sino ang pwede mag-demand ng fulfillment ng obligation, siya ang active subject in that case. So, what is this? What source of obligation is this? Obviously, this is a contract. So, sana malinaw sa atin yung concept ng obligation in general. So, what we learned today is yung obligations, what would the definition of obligation under Article 1156, the definition of obligation, the sources, and the kinds of obligation. There are four requisites of obligation. We have passive subject, active subject, object or prestation, and the juridical tie. There are likewise there are five sources of obligation. We have law, contracts, quasi-contracts, delicts, and quasi-delicts. And there are two kinds of obligations. We have real obligations and personal obligations. Real obligations are obligations to give, while personal obligations are obligations to do or not to do. Now, based on that, there are two sub-classifications of personal obligations. We have positive personal obligation, or the obligation to give, and the negative personal obligation. The there are two kinds of personal obligations. We have positive personal obligations, or the obligations to do. Sorry, I keep referring to this mistake here. Positive personal obligation and negative personal obligation, or not to do. So, pag to give something, real. Kapag to do something, personal. Okay? So, for next meeting, we will be discussing the other topics on obligations. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you read the required materials for this subject. If you have questions, you can always ask in our MS Teams, or in the video itself, or through Facebook Messenger. So, thank you and good afternoon.